Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by TheLastCurryRice. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about a diversity of base stats, like having a lot of different stats in your game. We're going to get into naming the stats and why even have so many stats and a whole bunch of stuff. Now, the parlay begins. Curry Rice says, I want to talk about the base status effects in Limbus Company, and then you've done something I really like, which is put just a list of every single kind of base status effect in Limbus Company. Not things like burn or bleed that synergize with a certain archetype, but all just the kind of basic mechanics of the game status effects. And I think you'll get the point of doing this in a minute. I'm going to read that list just verbatim to you right now. Here we go. Offense power up, plus coin boost, offense level up, damage up, haste, aggro, protection, defense power up, defense level up, implied to be physical, damage up, implied to be physical, power up, unit level, paralysis, offense power down, offense level down, plus coin drop, fragility, defense power down, defense level down, bind, and physical type fragility effects. Protection and defense power up. Okay, anyway, these are only ones you can inflict/gain from IDs as a basic status, not tied to factions or unique gimmicks, and not from egos. Yeah, this is a lot, and not so many of them feel very similar to each other. So many of them feel very similar to each other, because of name, icon, and function, that looking at this list, I can see why someone who wants clarity would like to see some of them deleted or combined into the same status. I did say that during the stream, and we will tackle that argument today. I think one problem I see is that Project Moon, the developer, decided to move away from naming some statuses, and instead gave them names that explain what they do. Here, Curry Rice is going to describe a perspective I haven't heard very often about naming status effects. I usually think of that as being maybe bad, and it's sort of nice that they explain what they are, but Curry Rice says, it would have been so confusing if bind/haste was named speed down or up. Fragile and protection named damage taken up or down. The ones that don't explain what the status does somehow make more sense than the ones that straight up explain what they do. Why in Wing's name did they decide it'd be a good idea to have unit levels, and offense power together in the same game? In Library of Ruina, the developer's previous game with similar mechanics, offense power up and down was named strength and feeble, and defense power up and down was named endurance and disarm. Why could they not just keep these kinds of terms to describe basic statuses, like with the speed and damage altering statuses? They even kept the icons for strength, feeble, endurance, and disarm as the red and green arrows, so it makes even less sense. Offense power-up is such a mouthful to say. So I'm going to stop here and respond a little bit, but we'll get back into it a little bit at the end too. This is an interesting way to view the problem. I mean, you're sort of saying two things here which I can really sympathize with. You note that in practice, I think most people would agree, it is a mouthful, it is confusing. Like, because the game has offense power up, offense level up, and damage up, and those things are named just offense power up, offense level up, and damage up, they're named what they do, but I think the phenomenon occurring is that they no longer explain what they do because those things are too similar for it to be easy to organize in most people's heads. So them having names would be more clear, even though the name wouldn't literally say what they do. But then I kind of disagree when you say it would have been so confusing if bind and haste was instead speed down and up. No, I don't think that would be confusing at all, because it tells you exactly what it does. And the only reason I don't think it would be confusing is because there are no other effects that say anything similar to, like, speed down and up. It's not like there would be an effect called speed power down and up, and then another effect called speed level or speed range down and up. You could do those. Limbus Company could have, like, your speed goes up 1 or 2, and then another effect that's like the range of speeds you can get increases, but it doesn't actually increase your speed. That would be silly and kind of pointless. I wonder where I'm going with this in the future, but you could do that. And I would argue that the reason that wouldn't be confusing in current Limbus Company, like, is that they don't have multiple forms of speed up and down. There's just speed up and down. So you could just name them speed up and down. And bind and haste are only good names because they are evocative names. It's not more clear, they're just not much less clear because I think bind and haste are very good status effect names. It feels like you know what they do. Because you pointed this out, though, I noticed something really like messed up about the status effects. So I'm gonna go through them again, and I think you'll see what it is. So remember, the point that Curry Rice is highlighting here is that there is this phenomenon that I think we can probably all agree with, that the ones that say their name are more confusing, are less clear in practice. But why is the place where I take issue. And what you'll note is that the ones that say what they do, but then it's not clear because there's a ton of other names like it, those are the ones where there are a lot of effects like that. And the ones that have a keyword name that doesn't explain what they do are only the effects that don't have other similar effects. So haste, for example, and bind, well, they're keyworded. It's a good name, but it doesn't directly explain what they do. No problem, whatever, but they don't explain what they do. And those are effects where there are no other similar effects. Nothing else affects like your speed. We have things like fragility, for example. There isn't really a sort of equivalent too much. I guess protection and fragility. So again, those are kind of the only ones that kind of increase all incoming damage, except for all the other ones. That's very frustrating, but they're kind of parallel. You see what I mean? Nothing does something really similar, but they sort of do. Maybe there's nothing here. I don't know, but I think you get the point. Whereas all the ones that are in a really similar clump, offense power up, offense level up, defense level up, physical damage up, physical power up, defense power down, defense level down, offense power down, offense level down. It's all of those where you would have benefited from having a keyword. Only those did they not keyword. And on the ones that are on their own, like bind and haste, where you would have benefited from just saying what it did, they didn't just say what it did. So what the hell is going on? Like, someone's screwing with us. Why? You know what I mean? Just a lot of things. You have a couple of feels about the naming further, so I'm going to finish reading those, but I certainly have some thoughts. There's something messed up going on here, for sure. You say you did feel like disarm felt like a bad name for the status, considering the word is usually tied to unable to attack in other games. Yeah, like disarming being like a debuff to damage instead of you can't attack is a little weird. Endurance/disarm, defense power up and down, are also in a weird place for Limbus Company since the upside for defensive skills doesn't scale in a similar way to offensive skills. I do wish guarding did something on top of the shield if you managed to roll higher than the opponent, or if defensive power-up did something to counter skills other than to deal more flat damage. I get that statuses are all meant to have counterparts to each other, but one face on a coin can't be 10 times more valuable than the other side. That's just poorly executed design. Yeah, it gets even weirder, really. A lot of them are like the name of the effect is parallel, but the actual status of the effect's power level in the game is not. It doesn't really make sense for them to be parallel. That's also sort of weird. So I don't know, there's a lot of stuff going on here, but I think that the biggest piece of detective work to do is why would you do this? Why are you doing that? You know, the ones that like we can disagree about the clarity for bind and haste. I don't really care. I'm just proposing the idea that don't you agree it would certainly be less confusing if those were called, you know, like speed down and up, because there aren't other speed down and up increases. And yet, even though that's where that would have been less confusing, that's where they didn't use that naming convention. And then with the ones where it's more confusing, they did use the confusing naming convention. Why? Like that's not a coincidence. There must be like it absolutely could be a coincidence, but let's assume it isn't. What might be a reason why you would do that? How did that happen? I think that it was probably a backfired attempt to make it clear, right? Like offense power up and offense level up are similar. So imagine that you made them into words. And as you say, there kind of were words for some of these things previously. You might think like, what if offense power up was called strength, like it apparently used to be, but then there was offense level up. And you would think, what's the difference between those? You know what I mean? Like, what isn't that just what strength is? Or if they both had their own name, but then when you read them, it said offense power up +1, and then the other one said offense level up +1. That is confusing. It's not more confusing than it is now when they just say that as their name, but it would be confusing. And so I think that this may have come from a misguided or possibly poorly translated, remember the game is originally in Korean, effort to make those effects that are too similar. The developer knows they're too similar, different from each other. Now, we're going to get into, so the next question is, why are they in the game? You even said yourself, why did you make offense level, unit level, and offense power even exist in the same game? Like, why are those even in the same game? My final point about the naming thing before we move on is basically just what I said before. I personally point the finger on there being effects that are too similar. Names for effects versus like just saying what the effect does. Personally, I think it is better for the effect to just say what it does. And if doing that makes the game confusing, it's because there are too many stats that are too similar, not that the idea of having the effect say what it does is bad. You see what I mean? Again, you can decide how much you like it or don't, but my core argument is simply that naming the stat offense level up is less bad. You might still not like it, but it's less bad if there isn't another stat called offense, power up, right? That's so similar. Naming a stat offense level up good, having another stat called offense power up bad. Exactly how much is up to taste, maybe. But I think that's the problem. That's where I'd point the finger. So why the hell did they do that? Like, why? Why? What is even the point of those things? Now, I will freely admit before we continue, I am not sure I completely understand, even having played Limbus Company for a long time, what the difference between these effects is. I kind of, sort of think I know, but then I sort of don't. Like, I sort of thought that offense power up would be you get one more, to your offense. And then as TheLastCurryRice is going to go on to argue, offense level up was added in as a like granular, smaller form of offense power up. I think that's what it does. But then what is clash power up? Like, why is that different from offense power up? And in fact, clash power up isn't in this list, but that is a mechanic in the game. Like, you can increase your clash power. So that, and then damage up. So does that not increase your clash power? I guess that sort of makes sense. Having an effect that lets you increase your clashing power, but not your damage, and having an effect that increases your damage, but not your clashing power, or they increase the other one negligibly, maybe. It doesn't seem like a bad idea, but I am going to argue that the complexity increase is far too high of a price to pay. The game becomes impossible to understand for most players for only a modest increase in flexibility. I personally think it would have been much better to just take the more granular one and keep only that. Offense level, if that's what that is, the one that can give you like part of an offense power, which TheLastCurryRice is going to go on to talk about. Now that my issue with nomenclature of status effects is out of the way, I want to gush about the 3 different offense statuses and why their existence is a great way to increase design space. Offense power up, offense level up, and damage up. All 3 of them make your skills deal more damage, 2 of them increase clashing, and 2 of them increase your damage output by 1% rather than a flat amount. Can't they make power up and damage up and be over it with it? In Library of Ruina, there was a definite issue in design space for coming up with key page designs, ID passives, because it could not make small increments of power-related effects. Because damage up in Ruina was flat, 1 damage up is 1 damage instead of 10% damage, damage up meant so little. So the best passive effects would be strength or any power-related effects. And then with how impactful clash power was, all they could do was change how you would get the clash power. Pierce power +1. On the first turn, +1 power. On turn 5, you get +1 power, etc. What the offense level up-down status effect in Limbus does is it adds knobbiness to a stat. So they have some design space issues freed up. Instead of a clashing power bonus needing to always make a difference, they can design them to be like 1/3 of a clashing power for a slower build-up that when combined with other offense level up effects could eventually become 1 clashing power. We'll pause here. So this is an excellent point. Like having a more granular one, it kind of sounds confusing, but you can see how that does solve a problem in theory. I guess in practice, I'm still not even remotely convinced that there's a good reason to have similar effects other than that. You see what I mean? Like if there are effects that just straight up increase your clashing power by 1, and then there's this effect that increases it by like 1/3, I would just take the one that gives you a third, although you will be going on to argue something a little similar. Like, I still feel like, and again, there's a problem here because these are so similar, because the things they do are so similar, I freely admit to you, I do not know what some of these effects do. Like, even after thinking about it for months on the stream, playing every single piece of content the game has ever released, and reading this parlay twice, 3 times now, I do not know what some of these effects do. I read what they do, and I still don't understand what they do. I would like to add a point that it doesn't matter what they do. That's another problem. One other argument I have against having this many effects is that you cannot understand what they do and never ever miss out on basically anything in gameplay because it doesn't matter what the difference between them is most of the time. You just want as much as you want. So I personally don't see any reason for there to be anything other than the granular one. And then again, you can sort of see how it would be nice to have one that only increased clashing power or only increased damage. Like, I can sort of get behind that. That could be a rarer thing, which could work all right. And I often feel like keywording those rare ones could be useful. We might talk more about that a little later, but the idea that if an effect is rarer, having it be a keyword can be useful in that it kind of draws your attention to this is something a little unusual. Keywording something more common is good because you learn the keyword and then it's useful more places. But that's a place where I would like just offense level up, and then oh, it increases my offense level. You learn what that does. There aren't 3 other similarly named things, so you can learn what that does, and then you kind of know that. You see what I mean? Some people are probably going to react to this part, and that's totally fine, by thinking, well, you're only frustrated because you don't learn. You just have to go learn it. And I guess I'm telling you, like, I do this for a living, and I have tried to understand this mechanic, and I also play the game quite successfully, and yet I somehow still don't understand this mechanic. Does it need to be this complicated? If that's the case, you can just say I'm very stupid. That's fine. But if you're gonna say that, then the token I want in the vending machine to call Zandy stupid is you have to engage with the question of why these need to be here, which I think Curry Rice has done. Like, I couldn't be less frustrated with you. And as you say, like, there is a very useful kind of granularity to one of these status effects, for sure, that I didn't initially understand. I kind of had the sense that, okay, I sort of get why offense level would be useful, but because of the lack of clarity of the status effects, which was your first point, I didn't really realize exactly until you put it like this that is useful. So I'm definitely down with this one. As you conclude the subject, because you have that knobbiness, because a third of a clashing power, 1 offense level up, technically has the floor of increasing your damage output by like 3%. It does still increase your damage. It's still something you want, but its effectiveness changes depending on context, which I feel makes for a great small reward to attach to skills, sort of like Rupture. This does have a kind of threshold problem that I want to talk about in a minute, but Curry Rice also adds, I suppose they could have gone with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Duel Monsters route and kind of upped the digit by a factor, up 10. So they can make power effects in multiples of 10 normally, but they can be divided up into smaller values. And that probably would have been a better implementation of that design space issue. I'm not sure if the game would have been more or less confusing if everything was in multiples of 10s. Yeah, the point I was going to make is just that there is a kind of like a threshold thing that I don't always like. So in current Limbus Company, if I've understood correctly, we have a situation where when you gain offense level up, once you hit a certain amount of it, once you have multiple of them, a set multiple amount of them, suddenly you gain 1 clashing power. It's a way to give you part of a clashing power, and then they give you a damage increase too. But because they did it that way, you can get into this weird situation where you have a lot of them, but just you need 1 more or it doesn't give you any clashing power. So if the clashing power is what's relevant, it doesn't, all of those that you got don't matter, especially because clashing is kind of all or nothing. Let's say that I'm clashing a 17 and my opponent is 20. I have to match or, supersede their clashing value, or I get hit. If I have 8 offense level, and that gets me close to enough clashing power, but not there, I get 0 credit for having all of that. Whereas if I, had 10 or 12, there you go. Which, obviously, that's kind of just how Limbus Company works, like people clash. But I think it's a useful thing to think about with how a threshold system like that, yeah, it does smell like it would be beneficial to make it just like more multiples, make everything, add a zero to everything, and then you can do, like 15 clashing power or whatever instead. I kind of agree with you. I'm not sure if that would be more or less confusing. Just putting literally more numerals on the screen can make things more confusing if they're not all just zeros. So, in a lot of card games, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a great example, but there are lots of games like this. Almost everything in the game has a power level that means it could be like 2 orders of magnitude smaller, but it's just not for to make it look bigger or something. So for example, in Magic, things have powers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In Yu-Gi-Oh, things have power like 2000, 1500 or whatever. But nearly all Yu-Gi-Oh cards, you could remove 2 zeros, and the like as long as you did that for every other card, they would remain unchanged, which is sort of silly, and I would argue doesn't really cause a problem. There are some Yu-Gi-Oh cards that do use those decimal places. That's kind of a complicated issue, so I won't talk about it too much as someone who has only played a little bit of Yu-Gi-Oh. It's not like there's no purpose for that design, but you get the point. I think if you literally just add zeros, it's not a big deal. But if the screen is going to use the granularity, which is what we're suggesting for Limbus Company, you're going to get into like 263 clashing power or whatever. That amount of like actual numbers on the screen does begin to kind of fry people's brains. Like, I think there is a mental load increase there. So to some extent, condensing this is a real need. I think we can all agree, whether you like the way they did it or not, you can't deny with Curry Rice's general point, which is that having that granularity is useful. You could still attack whether it is worth the cost mentally to the player, which yeah, like for offense level, maybe I'm sold. But again, for a lot of the other ones, I just don't. Anyway, there's also the whole idea of unit levels as a sort of base stat that needs to be associated with that. I suppose you don't need base stats, but if leveling up didn't scale up skills, how are we meant to feel progression other than the game giving us direct upgrades to kits, like how Ruina did? I do not like levels in these kinds of games because I hate the grind, and I hate being over-leveled, so I kind of wish levels didn't exist, but whatever. I think this is a surprisingly important point. I don't think that having levels because otherwise we don't have progression is a good point, but it's not your point. It is most game design's point. Totally. A lot of games have levels in them or unlock build options in a way that feels like the game is saying, well, we have to give you something to unlock, you know what I mean? Which, I don't know, man. I don't know if you do. I've thought about this a lot because I think it is a white whale for making timely for Limbus Company, which is in a Moby Dick themed chapter, because it is an important white whale to conquer for making build systems available from the beginning of a game. Almost every single time they are not. The reason is that they are the game's progression mechanic. So finding a solution to that so people will stop doing that if they don't want that to be how the game works would be huge. Like, that's one of the biggest hurdles to get over, in my opinion, if we're going to get from here to there and have games that kind of don't hold their build system hostage using grinding. And it's really encouraging to me when I hear all of you say, I really hate when games do that. We got to find a way to do something about that. We totally do, for sure. And that's kind of a different parlay than this. But I do want to try to tackle it a little bit here because I feel like there is something relevant to this parlay that you could get into. I personally feel like the exact reason for unlocking, like leveling or unlocking stuff as you go, unpacked a little bit more, may weirdly provide a solution to this status thing. So follow me for a minute and let's go on a bit of an adventure. Why, in games like Limbus Company, but lots of other games, do you unlock things over time? Gameplay options. If the game is gonna have meaningful build options, you do unlock them over time. But what are some of the reasons why games are designed that way? Well, one of them is that the game gives you something to earn toward. Of course, we know that. But another fairly obvious one is that, well, I suppose it would be overwhelming to a point. If you gave me every single game piece in the entire game from literally the very first time I get to play the game, I mean, I haven't played the game. So if the purpose of making those choices is for me to assert my preferences, I can't. I don't have preferences in this game yet, unless the game's systems are very similar to another game I've played, and then it's arguably pointless to have that game exist. So having me not get every single option available in the entire game right from the start, literally right from the start, does make sense, kind of. It's not like I can use them for anything until I've played the game a little more. So okay, that's something. So when to give the player those options? Well, I was interested in the idea that rather than giving the player the different build options, you actually sort of unlock or reveal layers of the game's effects, status effects, perhaps. For example, you kind of increase granularity as you go, or, the numbers get not larger, but like more specific. So we talked about how offense level up versus offense power up are kind of like a granular versus not as granular thing, I think. I really did try to understand these perfectly before going into this. And so what if you don't have offense level up until you hit a certain point of progression, and then every build piece that would have had it kind of gets it? Therefore, you have a lot of build options early on, but they don't have all of the mechanical complexity and mental overhead that they will eventually have. And then things that will add nuance to them kind of come out in the future. Or, strength on them that would be confusing for the player isn't added until the point that it seems reasonable to add that. Now, I'm talking the tutorial process. You know what I mean? Like you've played for an hour or two and that stuff starts unlocking. Not like 10 hours in, you begin unlocking status effects. Like that's ridiculous. I'm just saying to make it a little less overwhelming to start. Wouldn't it be interesting to introduce those things one by one, and then you really notice the difference between those effects? At the very least, that would help you teach those effects. And I like the idea that the player unlocks what each game piece does rather than the game piece itself, potentially, provided that they have some strengths that aren't just the status effects they'll unlock. For example, having in Limbus Company, like a charge-focused identity that has good effects, like good clashing maybe, but doesn't get their charge-based effects until later on, and therefore they are good on their own merits, especially relative to your other units who also don't have their other effects. They have their own strengths, but then they gain other strengths later down the line. Might be a nice piece of game design too, in that it would have you make a game that has things which have strengths that don't require that mechanical complexity and which do involve mechanical complexity. So I don't know. I mean, I think another solution to the naming thing is, if you agree, I would hate to do this whole parlay and say, you don't need all the status effects, I'm not convinced, just use the more granular one. Look, if I've misunderstood them and you're convinced that they have a benefit, I think where I'm coming from is maybe we can teach them better. Maybe they can be learned better. Making them all keywords isn't going to help in the current state of the game. You would need to do more. They're just too similar in their effect. And so even if you name offense power up, offense level up, and damage up different things, what are things we could do to make it easier to understand the admittedly small difference between them, if we agree that it is useful, a good trade-off in the design? One thing would be they unlock over time. There's a sort of gated stages tutorial process for the first few hours where those things come online in turn and you kind of see them happening, because it can be very difficult to notice a lot of the time in Limbus Company. That's one thing. Thing number two I wanted to bring up is the idea that Limbus Company is one of those games that could benefit a lot, like most highly, from the game having a little developer blurb next to each thing. I've heavily insisted on this in a lot of other Parley and just videos recently, because I don't really... It's not that I think it would fit every game, but I just can't think of any reason not to do it, really. So the idea here is that when you mouse over offense power up, for example, it probably says like you gain +3 offense power or something like that. And we've joked on the stream before about how Fragile doesn't explain what it does when you mouse over it. It just says, it's weird. It does this vague thing. It says like, do increase damage based on the effect's count for a duration. It's like, yeah, I figured that if I put on more fragile, it does more of whatever fragile does more. How much damage does it make me do? Like, why would you have a tooltip and then not say what the effect does? And instead just say, like, people die when they are killed, the tooltip. Like, what is that? And to Limbus Company's credit, the game has done some good work in that space. I mean, other games only do worse. And there is the kind of detail slider now where you can have the abilities to tell you everything or less things or whatever. But I would be advocating for the game literally saying quickly in a little text box, when you hover over offense power up, this is like one, clashing power or one, damage bump. And when you go over offense level up, it says, this is a more granular version of offense power up that is there to let you gain like a fraction of that at a time, something like that. Again, if that's what it does, that's the last time I'm going to say that in this parlay. You see what I'm trying to say? Having the game literally just say, like, why does this exist? Like, what is the purpose of this? Or have the symbol for them be like a small version of the symbol for the other one. That could help a lot for the intuitiveness. That's an area of visual design I'm not fully qualified for, but you can imagine how if offense level up had a thing that was like mini little arrows in a little formation, and then if you have like 2 offense level up, the symbol is 2 mini arrows. 3 offense level up is 3 mini arrows, and eventually it adds up to an offense power up. Finally, if you made it so one status that is meant to be like a granular version of another literally became the other one when you have enough of it, and adjusted the game accordingly, I think that would help. It would help reduce the mental overhead of managing them all if the game visually represented one of them as being just like the mini version of another. Or again, even if they're not that somehow, which breaks my brain at this point that they wouldn't be. There's only 2 things that you even can anyway, whatever, I'm not going to get hung up on that. The game could at least make the effort to say on the tooltip, why is this in the game? Like, what is the purpose of this effect? When something doesn't boost your clashing power, but it boosts your something related to offense, saying this does not boost your clash ability, this is only for getting in damage, or this does not boost your damage ability, this only boosts your clashes. And I don't know, I mean, to close out, I do remain skeptical of your idea that it would be more confusing if bind haste was named speed down and up. Again, you can disagree if you want to, but I am tempted to argue that you only think that because the offense power up, offense level up, damage up ones are so bad and confusing because there are lots of similar effects. And in no way is it more confusing if the game just says what the effect does. An example that came to mind just then, you saw it in my eyes, was plus coin boost. I like that one. It's quite clear. And the reason is it's different enough in its wording. It actually says what it does. It actually tells you what it does. Plus coin boost is great. You know what it does. It makes plus coins get boosted by that amount. It's specific. That's the thing. Offense is too general of a word. And the way that Limbus Company uses power and level is too nuanced, in my opinion. Like, it's too out of the ordinary from... My brain is also kind of breaking a little bit with, this is just a personal thing, but I think it is a problem. Offense level. Level is often a superior word to power. Like, you gain a little bit of power or you gain a level. Level is often bigger. But in Limbus Company, I believe level is smaller instead. That's a small thing, but again, it adds up when these effects are so similar. So credit where credit's due. I think I agree with you that certainly giving them a keyword name helps avoid that type of thing if the name is just totally different. But I continue to argue that the only real problem is that they're all so similar, and that makes having the name written out look bad. But in fact, if you just don't have that problem, then writing the name out is fantastic. You just have to do it effectively and not have so many really similar effects. But I've harped on that enough. Again, I just want to make my point. You don't have to disagree. I mean, you don't have to agree. You're free to disagree. I think you do make an interesting point that it's like weirdly more effective to just have the word in some ways. That's something I hadn't really thought before because I hate having those proper noun contingent difficulty. You have to learn this outside of the game things so much. that you made a point I wouldn't have gotten to before, which is that they are better in some ways. They have some strengths. They're definitely not to be fully avoided. It's so obvious what aggro does that it isn't really necessary for that not to be a keyword, or like haste and bind, I think. I kind of wish bind was just called slow or something, but you get the point. Like those are good enough keywords that I think the elegance, you lose so little understanding that it's kind of worth it maybe. Especially because Limbus Company doesn't have any similar thing like multi-attack or whatever. Haste could be like you attack faster or something, rather than just you act earlier in the order. But Limbus Company doesn't have a mechanic like that, so you or a status effect like that anyway. So it's not really a concern. Um, I just wanted to conclude with what Curry Rice concluded with. I'm not really sure what you're meant to do with this rant. Well, I was sure there's tons of things you can do with it. This was great. Maybe I'd like to hear what you think of naming statuses to convey concepts clearly. I mostly don't like it, and I think it's made a lot worse when the statuses are so similar, but more nuanced than I thought. And the diversity of base stats. I'm still not convinced that there needs to be anywhere near this many, but I definitely accept the idea that there is a reason to add more stats. I just personally think that, actually, a couple things about this point. One is that I'm not totally convinced of it in Limbus Company, but a broader point that I would like to briefly make is that I think developers frequently underestimate how much it costs most players to add more mechanics to a game. Like a lot of developers are aware that adding more mechanics adds more complexity and respect the idea that that is in conflict with fun for most players. If you're trying to make the game fun, having the least mechanics that you can have while retaining the fun is best. And the problem is that there is no objective answer to that, because at some point adding like somewhere around here more mechanics will make the game more fun, but also less fun for some people, more confusing. And if the player does eventually come to understand the mechanics, then it's just the fun. And so you do have to weigh that trade-off, and there's no real right answer. But I do want to say that my broad opinion is that most developers do underestimate that value. I think most games would improve a little bit if the developer valued complexity as being a little more expensive to add to a game, if making the game a little bit simpler was the developer's priority. I think a lot of games are not willing to sacrifice almost any complexity in exchange for simplicity, and I believe that is a mistake. I think you are essentially insisting that your game is better as a philosophical topic than as like a thing to be played. And I think that is very much the case with Limbus Company status effects. They're confusing and unnecessary enough that you can just play the game without them, and I think that that means that they might as well not be there much of the time. But I accept that in theory there could be a reason they could be useful, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. It could be that just reorganizing things around them would help them access the value there. But again, viewing the addition of a status effect as more expensive from a development perspective would likely lead the developer to realize, okay, if we insist this is good, we have to work hard to make it more clear. And I just don't think that that was fully done in Limbus Company. Again, I hate to be so harsh. I mean, I feel like Limbus Company does a better job than a lot of games. They at least make the effort. There are levels of detail and there are descriptions. They're just not good. If they just improve that stuff, it'll be great. Like, I feel like Limbus Company deserves praise in this case. It's not the simplest game either, like under the hood. So I don't know. Like, I can't complain too much. In Limbus Company, you know, this diversity of base stats is like skill power and skill offense power, but in other games it'd be like base versus bonus damage, attack speed, armor piercing on hit effects, rather than your offense stats just being one thing. End of rant. Project Moon, please update Fragile's tooltip. Bind is based. Offense level is super knobby. It sure is. I think that the final example you gave is a real kicker. In a lot of games, there's enough different ways you attack that it's very easy to make the names sound different. Armor piercing, you pierce armor. That's not really a keyworded name, like you pierce armor, whatever that is. Attack speed versus base damage. This is one of the world's best intuitive separate multiplier examples. People just kind of get that that's gonna mean you attack more often for more damage. And then once you make that mental connection, you don't need to know underlying math to know that that will multiply your base damage. It just does. You can see visually that it does. if you have a greatsword and you attack really fast versus a dagger and you attack really fast, most people intuitively understand that the greatsword attacking really fast is more damage because the greatsword does more damage per hit. So if they attack at the same speed, that's a bigger multiplier, sure. And so I feel like that's a great example of how Limbus Company's linearity, not having that many different options, is part of where the mental confusion may be coming from. Anyway, I thought this was a great topic. I mean, I don't think it was a rant at all. I feel like that was great structured. You made quite a few good points too. I still remain skeptical, mostly out of a desire to be very harsh to these subjects. Like I want to really interrogate whether it is absolutely necessary. I'm not saying there's no point. I'm just asking whether it's a worthwhile trade-off when taken as a whole. And I'm not saying that having the names be keyworded is bad. I'm just questioning whether it's really that bad for them to say what they do, or if it's because the stats themselves are a little bit messy. So I don't know. I'm kind of in between the two of them. But you certainly convinced me partway. I love it when Parley kind of changed my mind, and this one sort of did. And I thought you explained like what the point of those things was very well. I thought that was a great strength of this Parley. Yeah, we talked a lot in a recent Parley too about the whole thing about hitting like a lot of times versus one time and having a lot of damage on one hit versus many hits and stats like that. It's interesting how this is sort of the opposite version, like how stats in a game or status effects or buffs also kind of tie into that type of thing. Very interesting. Enjoyed it. Looking forward to more of them, perhaps.